In 2020, we celebrate 150 years since the laying of the foundation stone of All Saints Petersham. So much about Australia and Petersham and All Saints has changed since that time, but the foundation that our church rests on has stayed the same. Now, we may consider All Saints a very old building, and by Australian standards, it is. But when we think of it on a worldwide scale, it's almost laughably young. And even more so when we think of it in light of the foundation of the gospel on which it was built. We read in 1 Peter chapter 2, "As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, 'See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame.' Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Although our building is beautiful and its history is valuable, it's actually not these bricks that are at the heart of All Saints, but Christ, the cornerstone, and the people that he has chosen as the living stones to be built into his spiritual house. So as we look at the history of our beautiful church, it is Christ and his people who are really at the heart of this story. Originally, All Saints was part of the parish of St Peter's, Cooks River. The area the rector was called to service at the time included Newtown, Botany, Cooks River, Georges River, Petersham and Canterbury. Reverend J.S. Hassel, who was appointed as the minister there in 1848, wrote that the area of Petersham was fairly easy to take care of as there was but one house in Petersham. He goes on to say that he often had to ride home on pitch dark nights through Petersham bush and never saw a track. It wouldn't be long, however, until there were signs of growth in the suburb. In 1855, the Sydney to Parramatta Railway was opened and it stopped in Petersham. The train line was a turning point for Petersham. It turned the suburb from a rural fringe where some wealthy people might choose to live to avoid the working class areas like Newtown to a place that was accessible and affordable for the working and middle class. It was on the 15th of April in 1860 that the first service of the Petersham parish was held in a tiny schoolhouse that had been built 3 years earlier. The congregation was very small in those early days, but as one historian notes, they were strong in faith and full of zeal and resolved to erect a building to be used for worship and for the education of children in the district.
Once a church is established in an area, even as a branch church, basically people are going to go to the church for baptism, for weddings, for funerals. As people have, even if they're not regular attenders, will have some sense of belonging to the church. They have a very important pastoral role because at this time the minister is really the one who is the counsellor when it comes to situations of grief or of other things, because the sort of counselling we take for granted today wasn't around then, and the sort of social services we take for granted today weren't around either. The churches tend to be the provider of most of the social services. So as well as preaching and Sunday services, the minister did a lot of work, particularly visiting, pastoring, caring for people, and just working generally in the community.
In 1869, Petersham was split from the parish of Canterbury and became a parish in its own right. Reverend H.A. Palmer, who had been the minister of the combined parishes, now became the first rector of Petersham. Petersham was the smaller of the two newly formed parishes, but under Palmer, the church continued to grow, and within a year they had begun ambitious plans to build a new church building. It was estimated would cost them about £1,700. They were only able to raise about £600 of this on their own and had to apply to several banks before they were granted a loan to be able to go ahead with the building project. The land where the church was eventually built and where it stands today was one of the highest rises in the area. The land came to the church by a bequest from Mrs. Priddle, who had inherited the land from her brother, Dr. Wardell. It was only 35 years earlier, in 1834, that Dr. Wardell had been murdered by bushrangers in the vicinity of where Gordon Street now sits. This gives you an idea of how quickly the suburb developed. The architecture of the church was carefully considered and reflected the gospel-centred focus of the church at the time.
You can tell the theology of the church at the time from the architecture. So this church, there's a very similar church by the same architect in called St. Peter's in Darlinghurst. Same W-shaped roof, same shape and size. That one's built out of stone, this one's built out of brick using brand new technology. It's only 10, 20 years later. And the brickwork, first time that was used for such grand buildings, a very advanced technology. But its width for its depth brings the congregation closer. So instead of having a cross-shaped church, it's a wide church, hence the W-shaped roof. And so the concern to bring the congregation closer to the preacher and to the front shows the evangelical intent in that aspect. The use of the iron pylons all the way down, as opposed to big stone ones that are common in cathedrals, shows you the use of modern technology to be able to do something smaller so that you can see through. It's designed for the congregation to see and participate. The sloping floor, ever so slight, and yet everyone can see, and the preacher can see everyone. Yes, they can. Evangelical concern.
The day the foundation stone was laid was a big community event. The Herald reports, some little delay was caused by the size of the foundation stone, which was so large, being nearly 2 tons in weight, that the machinery employed by the workmen to rehoist it repeatedly gave way when the ropes were brought to bear upon the mass. This difficulty, however, after a while, was got over by the voluntary aid of some of the intelligent bystanders, who, by means of a timely leverage, when all was done that was required, lifted the dead weight into its appointed place. Today we mark 150 years since the laying of that foundation stone. We actually don't know where exactly that massive stone lies under our church building, but ultimately, it's not that important, because the foundation stone is just what holds up our church building, not what holds up our church. This beautiful building that has been handed down to us is something that we can be grateful for. Its history is interesting, it's an important part of the recent history of our suburb, but this building will one day crumble. We're seeing signs of that happening around us already. And even though that day will be sad, it won't be catastrophic, because the foundation stone that matters will still stand strong. The gospel of Jesus Christ was standing firm long before this church was built, and will continue to stand strong long after it falls apart. And the bricks that Jesus values are not the ones that stand around us, but the living stones from which his church is built. The men and women and children that he has called to be part of his church, to build his church, to be the living stones from which this spiritual house is built. Bishop Barker, in his address on that day when the foundation stone was laid, reminded everyone present of the true purpose of this building. People shouldn't come here to admire the architecture or the grandeur of the building. Instead, this was a place to come to know and to worship God. This is what he said. Around that elevated and beautiful site reside many whose duty and privilege it will be there to assemble for worshipping God, for hearing his holy word read, and for listening to the preaching of the gospel. I trust that you would also cooperate with your minister as to encourage him in his designs to raise that church for your common use and to labour in all other ways for your spiritual advantage.